Um, so I hope you have a nice weekend. Our laboratories will start today and Wednesday. I'm still fighting a good battle with the construction people. You're going to have to come around the lab. The room is 164, but you cannot get in through an interior door. You have to walk outside and walk around the north end of the building. And I have little signs up. I put them up today. And they'll guide you with little arrows to get to the back door, and we'll let you in. Yeah, so our lab starts today. Anything else about lab? Oh, the blood pressure cuffs you're working with are $250 to $350, depending on which models. They're quite expensive. Try not to throw them to the ground, to the cement floor. Kind of work with them over things so that if they fall, they land on the patient's belly. Soft. Go. All right. And remember, it will be crowded, but it's cozy. Cozy. Think of it as cozy. It'll actually be nice. All right, so to finish up where we stopped last time, by the way, this is slide 26 of lecture 2. Someone asked the question about afterload. And so, do you guys remember these things? You see them now quite often in NPV 110C, I believe. But this is a left ventricular pressure volume loop. Two things that will drive you crazy about this unless you clarify it right away. The first is all of these phenomena, these pressures and these volumes, they're inside the left ventricle. That's where they're being measured. The way you do one of these is you put a catheter into the left ventricle and make your measurements there. Then the second thing is there is no time on this. This is pressure versus volume. So you now have to deduce time, right? So the easiest way to do this, always start down here. If you don't put arrows on them, you get lost fast. Start when the heart is maximally empty of volume and is at nearly zero pressure. Well, that's got to be at the end of the systole when it just starts to relax. Very little pressure, very little volume. Then notice how it grows in volume with no change in pressure. Well, that's got to be diastolic filling, right? At this point, notice there's a little kick in pressure. It runs out of compliance and the pressure jumps up to maybe 5 millimeters of mercury. That's enough to slam the atrial, the mitral valve shut. And now notice, because you'll get this, the volume comes fixed, and the only thing that happens is the volume grows in pressure. What's that? Isovolumetric systole. Okay? Then at that point, where you suddenly see pressure continues to increase, but as pressure continues to increase, the volume is emptying. So what is that? That's the ejection phase of systole. What that means is that dot right there is the energy, the energy taken to open the aortic valve. Does that make sense? Okay. So we'll go through real quickly. One way to think about it, since we were starting to talk about determinants of the size of the stroke volume, preload is the amount of stretch. So if instead of 160, 70, 80, 90, 100, 110, 120, 130, so if instead of 130 you filled the heart up to here, you would get a bigger stroke volume, and that would be an example of preload enhancing stroke volume. You'll see an example of afterload in just a moment, I think. Well, I'll go right now. So notice, if the aortic valve is opening at something like 81 millimeters of mercury, this strongly implies that the arterial tree in the diastolic phase must be about 80. So you just got the diastolic pressure, 80. What's the systolic pressure? What's the peak pressure in the tree?
120.
Right? So we got a 120 over 80 here. But one thing to remember, afterload is a function of peripheral circulation, not of the heart. The heart responds to afterload. It does not create it. So the things that you can get whenever you see one of these pressure volume loops from the ventricle, you should really calculate 4 different things. The easy ones that we just did are diastolic blood pressure and systolic blood pressure. That's 2 things. the blood pressure. Okay? The second thing you should always calculate is the difference between the maximally full heart and the maximally empty heart must be what was shoved out into the aorta. So the stroke volume is the difference between these two. Remember I taught you guys in 101, the stroke volume is not nearly as powerful a variable as if you take the stroke volume and then divide it by the end-diastolic volume. You guys remember what that's called? The ejection fraction is the fraction of the maximal filling of the heart that was actually squirted back out. And ejection fraction is probably the single biggest metric to describe how a heart functions. Is that all okay so far? Yay. So this is a preliminary to go back to, remember we were talking about, is a heart rate of 50 and a stroke volume of 100 the same as a stroke volume of 100 and a heart rate of 50? And the answer is mathematically, in terms of cardiac output, yes. But now we're going to start, you'll see by next lecture, we're going to turn and look at the heart's needs. So far we've been talking about how the heart serves the rest of the body. But you have to remember, it itself is a muscle, which means it has blood flow needs, it has oxygen delivery needs. And so we're going to start to look at that. So this is cardiac energetics. What does it cost the heart to do its job? So when you look at one of these flow volume curves, it is important to, and some genius did this, because I'm not smart enough to have figured this out, but someone figured out that, in the initial filling of the heart, as it goes from zero, there's a certain amount of work being done. There is pressure or work done through distance. Yes? And then when you do your isovolumetric contraction, remember that's just like an isometric contraction in a muscle where there is actual stretching of the internal elastic elements inside. So watch my biceps tendon right here and the margin of my bicep. So there is work being installed into the heart, and that's proportional to that. So some genius, who is not me, figured out that if you take this peak point at the end of systole and then draw the line back through zero, you capture an area under the curve that is the internal work of the heart. That is to say, the passive filling and the pressurization necessary. And so that represents the internal work. And then once you blow open the aortic valve, the external work, as we've said, is contained in here. Right? Pressure through distance. Yay. Is this making sense? So this is going to start to hint to you which of those two ways of creating the same cardiac output might be better. It's implying that with each beat of the heart, you're spending internal energy that's never expressed. Does that make sense? One way to think about this is, same as on a bicycle, when you move your leg, there's energy cost in this, right? And so for humans, usually optimal is somewhere around 90 to 100. If you ask a person to move their leg at 130, they can do it, but their external expression of force will actually drop off because they're spending so much of the muscular energy accelerating and decelerating their leg. Does that make sense? Because that's in a way, this is a beat of the leg. So does that start to, let's see, we'll take a survey among the students. So which do you guys think, to get the same cardiac output of 5, heart rate of 50, stroke volume of 100, or heart rate of 100, stroke volume of 50, which one is cheapest, least expensive to the heart? Remember, the problem is the heart rate, every time you take a beat, this much work it consumes oxygen without doing anything for forward pumping. Watch, you'll see. Good. So this is a study that sort of addresses a similar kind of question. It gets directly into stroke volume. To create the same amount of stroke volume, you could do it So if the initial size, what they're trying to do is have the initial, let's see, here's the initial curve here. And what they've done is added afterload, going from here to here, to get, by adding afterload and creating more pressure pumping, so you get a stroke volume that's that big. All right? Notice that what happens, because it lifted this line by that amount, you wind up adding a bunch more internal work doing pressure load. Notice this is the same amount of additional work, but what you've done is just add preload with the same opening pressure of the aorta. That leaves the internal work constant. The internal work does not grow. You invested it all here in filling and there in pressuring. And so the internal work doesn't change and you get more total forward pumping. So once again, does that help? Having big old stroke volumes at a low heart rate, and one way to remember that, Shahan and everyone else, is what happens with the training effect, the way that you do your resting pulse? What happens? Lower heart rate, bigger stroke volume. Trust nature to have done the right thing. That's the least expensive way to run a heart. That makes sense. Very sophisticated. And so here's a summary. Oh, well, that was this curve. I inherited these lectures from Dr. Harris, Samantha Harris, and she thought it was reasonable to have 50 to 60 slides per lecture, which is of course insane. And so I'm still cutting them down. So every once in a while they'll be, forget it, you can read it on your own if you want. So this is cool. This is showing you the effects of preload and afterload. So this is from Mormon and Heller, so you can look at it, whatever I just gave you. Oh, I have the book here if anyone wants to check it out. And notice they're showing if you simply fill the heart more, you get more stroke volume. That's because of optimizing actinomycin overlap, and we'll talk about that, I think, next lecture. Notice that when you increase afterload, remember, when you say increase afterload, you're almost implying a pathological situation. So, many of you are like this. The other day in the lab, as the TAs were doing a run through, this was my measured blood pressure. My heart had to spend 20 millimeters more of its contractile energy, the quantum of contractile energy per beat, in pressurizing my blood before it could begin ejecting it. Well, what that means is you take what would have been ejected and move it over here to create pressure energy. So when someone has untreated hypertension, their heart begins to specialize in pumping tiny little stroke volumes at extraordinarily high pressures high enough to actually damage the tubing, to ruin the vessels, which is why it's a big deal to have high blood pressure. Over the long term, it will destroy the blood vessels. Does this all make sense? Oh, and then I reminded you that if you can just remember what athletes do, remember when you become trained, you have an increased blood volume, you actually lower the blood pressure operating characteristics of the circulation. So if anything, afterload actually decreases. And so the heart becomes specialized in pumping giant low pressure stroke volumes forward. Does that help? As a reminder? Okay. I think that's the end of the lecture. We can get into today. Questions while I reboot? So we just talked a little bit then about the energetics of the heart, and now I find that the last lecture, this lecture, and the next lecture, they're all kind of tangled. If it was me, I would rewrite them into 2 shorter lectures, but I didn't have the time to do it, so forgive me, I went for a bike ride instead. Really enjoyed the bike ride. So, there's your labs. Labs start from the back door. So, we pretty much just finished this, and I'll review it a little bit. But because each beat of the heart costs internal work that you don't get back, it's better to take big chunks of stroke volume and pump them forward at low pressure. That's your most optimal way. And then before we leave, I think we've already talked about the determinants of cardiac output, but apparently I'm going to talk about them again. I just will obey. So we've answered that question. During each cardiac cycle, muscular work is expended internal and external to the heart. Therefore, the best way, internal work done against structural elements in the heart, the wall of the heart, the valves, that's dissipated as heat. So anything that increases that size versus this is good. That would be a slower heart rate will do that. An increased preload will do that. A lowered afterload will do that. And you'll notice that all three of the things I just said do enhance ejection fraction cardiac function. Oh, we just said this. See how it overlapped there? It's the same figures. So now we're going to go back and talk again about what makes cardiac outputs. And the one that always bugs me that the cardiologists never mention is, because it's absolutely clear, the heart is what's called a demand pump. A sump pump in a basement is the same way. How much does it pump? Well, however much water drops into it. That's what the heart is. Everything about the way it's laid out does that. And so as we go through the forward-facing cardiogenic sources, never forget that if no blood comes back to the heart, it does not pump blood. So one of the reasons I talk about the blood coming back, many of you guys say, well, when you pump the blood away, doesn't it have to come back? And in a rigid tube, if you had a system of rigid tubes leading away from the heart, if this went back and then you had a rigid tube coming back, true that, you pump away, it must come back. The problem is that that kind of a system with rigid tubing, in order to get higher levels of flow, you require astronomical pressures that will blow up the blood vessels. So what we have is a compliance system. Right now, 1/5 of your, sorry, I said it wrong. Yeah, 1/5 of your 5-liter blood volume is in your arteries. 4/5, 80% of your blood is sort of trickling through your veins, kind of going, nothing to do today. No exercise yet. Right? And so you can pump blood away and have it not come back. It simply swamps out in the venous system if you're not careful. Remember, compliance has a true definition. It's the amount of volume change you get in a container per unit of pressure change. And so here are arteries which are stiff. You have a change in volume in the artery of that much, and the blood pressure leaps up. Okay? These are veins. Veins are what are called compliance vessels, so that you can put a rather huge amount of volume tucked away in the veins without raising venous pressure terribly. Okay? And again, that's a useful thing. Veins are where you keep your 5-liter blood volume when you don't want a cardiac output greater than 5 liters a minute. Recirculation time at rest is 10 to 15 seconds. So you're pumping 1 liter is in the arterial tree at any instant. That liter circulates in about 10 seconds, 15 seconds, and then you pump another liter. So it comes out 5 liters of arterial blood. But it means the other 4 liters are they need to just sort of wiggle through the veins slowly, or they get wet. Does anyone remember from EXP 101, the biggest way to enhance the draining out of the veins, if we want to use that blood for high cardiac output? And Sarah? Okay, very good. So the great minds think alike. So if you actually want to know what the driving characteristics for venous return are like any other segment of a hydraulic system, there's a forward pressure, and at rest, I've told you many times that the resting Venules only have a residuum of the 100 millimeters that the heart put into that blood, 7 is left at rest. I find that terrifying. It has to go all the way back to the heart with a 7 millimeter pressure head. I sure hope the downstream pressure in the vena cava flow. See what I mean? Yeah. So, if you're going to describe venous return characteristics, you can't count on the cardiac output stuff. You have to do the venous characteristics. The driving pressure is the pressure in the systemic venules. The back pressure for flow to the heart is the pressure in the right atrium. And then the resistance to flow is the summed resistance of the veins. We get a huge bonus factor here because resistance to the veins, they don't have muscle, so they can't change very much. So the resistance to flow in the great veins doesn't change. They're like arteriosus. And the pressure in the right atrium at rest is generally 0. So both of these fall out. And if you want to know what creates venous return, it's the pressure in the systemic venous, primarily. And so, following up on the two who responded to my question, this is a venous return curve. Anyone who hasn't seen one of these, I'll talk to you about it in office hour, because I don't want to make the rest of the people cry. But it's showing you that as long as you have a central venous pressure, remember that's back pressure, so this graph, for practical, for empirical reasons, is graphed against the right atrial pressure, because you can't measure the pressure inside a trillion little venules. So you graph this against the back pressure, which means the higher the back pressure in the right heart, the lower the venous return. One of the cool things about this graph is that where it zeroes out on the x-axis, what conditions create no flow if flow is created by a pressure gradient? When does flow stop? When the pressure gradient goes away. And so it is fascinating that this non-venous, this non-invasive venous, it's in the heart. You can actually figure out the average pressure in a trillion venules because at 7, flow stops. And so that implies that the driving pressure in the peripheral veins at rest is 7. That's called stop flow, and you actually can do that in an animal or a human. You have to undo it rather quickly. So right? And so the way we enhance venous return for exercise, there's really two factors. The first is, as soon as you start exercise, that generalized sympathetic vasoconstriction shuts off the two most high compliant systems, which is the gut shuts down, the blood flow to the gut, and the venous perfusion of your skin. The veins of the skin are unusual in that they actually have a little bit of musculature, and they will shut down too. So both arterial flow and venous flow in the gut and the shut down. In the working muscle, whatever muscle you activated because of these valve systems, the more the muscle contracts, the greater the amount of muscle you recruit and the harder it contracts, the more it pressurizes the peripheral venous blood. And for those of you, I think my TAs haven't heard this, the students will occasionally say to you ventriculitos, which, as you know, is not a properly known scientific term. I call these the ventriculitos. These little, right? It's a chamber. It's got an in and an outflow. There's muscular pressurization, and I can show you evidence from these things can generate 90 millimeters of mercury of internal pressure. So they are truly the little hearts. There's trillions of them, but they equal the function of the big heart when you're exercising. Yes.
Did you say the skeletal muscle pump or the SMS inhibitor of venous restriction causes increasing pressure?
They both do. If you're doing big exercise with a lot of muscle mass, this wins. If you're doing a small exercise like screwing a thing into the wall, the central nervous system.
Okay.
Yeah, it's about the mass. Good. Any questions up to here? Okay, to ask questions. What does this say? We're going to explain why preload is so cool. So that's our next trick. For my next trick, nothing up on sleeves. Remember, the way you get muscle is linear. it's very, because of the way sarcomeres are laid out, muscle functions in a linear sheet plane. If you want to do three-dimensional contraction, what you do is you wrap the sheets of muscles in circles. And embryologically, if you study the development of the heart, it's so cool because these swirls of muscle fall down from the valve ringlet and create these swirling masses. And that's how you get something that pulls in. Now, the Frank Starling law of the heart is that the more volume you put in a heart, little volume, lots of volume, the more volume you put in a heart, the bigger the stroke volume. If you put ejection fraction there, it's even better. But hearts work better when you fill them more. Here's a visual for those of you who aren't graphical. Here's showing if you were to somehow increase the reservoir pressure from the systemic venules from 7 to 14, this then becomes a distending force, and that distending force enhances function. So when I was an undergrad, they explained this to me and said, it's true, it's true, it's true, it's true, and never said why. It was like magic. And it turns out to be really super easy. Why? At least in the first levels. It is. Do you remember when we learned in exercise physiology that when you stretch, if you have a sarcomere that's at sub-resting length, and you start to actually extend it to a little more than resting length, it actually enhances the amount of force you get, the length-tension relationship. And our preliminary idea of why that's happening, and it's true, there's more reasons why it happens, is that you're optimizing the overlap. So a heart at rest, I'm implying a heart at rest is understretched. The actins are way too close to the myosin. And if you were to simply add a little more fluid, it would sort of optimize the actinomyosin overlap so that every active binding site had a myosin head that could hit it. That would automatically increase function. Well, it turns out that's most of what the Frank Starling law is doing. So, stretch makes a happy heart. I see. You may not have thought of this, and I'm not going to hammer it too hard. I think there's only one question in the entire class about this, but it's really interesting to notice. I've just told you hearts like stretch. At rest, hearts are understretched. They're waiting for that blood to come out of the veins and exercise. One reason you tell humans had a high level of physical activity in their evolution. Hearts at rest are. So hearts want stretch, especially if you can increase the pressure inside the atria to get that initial atrial kick, and everything just goes around the circuit with more stretch. What is the problem of having a high atrial pressure in the right heart or the left heart? It doesn't matter where. What's the problem of having a high pressure here for venous return? It's the back pressure, isn't it? And so it's important to notice at rest, if somehow you were to pressurize the left atrium, or right atrium with a high amount of pressure, that would actually be a bad thing because it would destroy the venous return. It would actually, for a few beats, you would get a hell of a cardiac output, but then it wouldn't be stable. And so the condition for allowing enough stretch in the central circulation for the heart to function well is to somehow get the veins to increase their pressure of blood within them. And as I told you, that is to shut off the baggiest, saggiest, swampiest vessels of the skin and the gut, and then pump through skeletal muscle activation on the valve veins. So that's the combo that gets you into exercise. There's no way to get to, see here, this is showing you that if you artificially were to increase it, these are done with catheters, you artificially flood the right atrium with fluid, it works great. It increases the cardiac output, but the venous return drops. And so, in a very short period of time, the heart goes, which is not a good characteristic, right? So, in order to have increased pressure in the central circulation, you must have increased pressure driving the venous return back, or it all falls apart. let's see, we talked about that. Getting tired of talking about this. Preload, yeah. Okay, sure. Oh, these are summaries. Oh, so we've talked about preload, we've talked about afterload. Let's talk about contractility. Contractility, remember I told you one of my students was Sahab Chef, who is now, I don't know where Sahab Chef is, but he once said, so you're saying if the curve moves this way, it's preload, if the curve moves up, it's afterload, if the curve moves this way, it's contractility. It's like, God, it's really that easy? I can do it with one slide. You're ready to know that now. So when you see the same filling as the initial, you see the same opening pressure as the initial, and the heart simply empties more with greater force for no apparent reason, that's contractility. Right? Contractility is the forcefulness with which the heart contracts, independent of its initial stretch. You have to put in that preload because everything about the heart is really made to respond to stretch. And so when cardiologists talk about contractility, they say, oh, I enhanced the contractility by adding more fluid to the heart. No, you didn't. What you did is enhance preload. If you inject dopamine, a powerful catecholamine, that will stimulate the heart to empty more, even with the same filling. Ignacio.
What happens to the internal work when the increased contractility is on?
Good for you. We'll look at that. It actually, as you might guess, what you're doing is creating higher levels of calcium in each cell. That's what ultimately the catecholamine is doing. And creating more actinomycin cross bridges. So actually the energetics of this is bad, it's expensive, and you'll see that you actually create a stiff myocardium, just like when your muscles are, you actually stiffen the myocardium. So I think I might have that picture. Let's see. So, as we said, if you go to this end point and draw a line back through zero, the area under it tells you the internal work, and it's showing you that with catecholamine stimulation, you do get more bang for your buck, but it costs you more energy, and your internal work goes up. So again, I have time to give you a clinical example. Someone having a heart attack, you get into this problem all the time. So the person's heart is stunned or dying. So a piece of it's dying, and the rest of it is kind of walking. And so their blood pressures are 100 over 60. And they're kind of nauseated, and they're pale, and their nose is blue. And so you think, what should I do? Well, the temptation is to give them a powerful stimulant like dopamine to create a blood pressure. Does anyone see the drawback? The heart is already suffering with, it can't deal with the workload it already has, and so you're going to give it more work. It's like whipping a dying horse. We do it, but it's kind of mean. The nicer thing to do, and you'll hear this all the time, Kelly, whoever of you hangs out in hospitals or doctors, you hear them say, can we maximize afterload reduction? We hear that all the time. If you could instead drop, so maybe their diastolic pressure is down now at 50 or 40, and their systolic pressure is down at 90, right? And so they're not allowed out of bed because if they stand up, they pass out. But it's like, nurse, could you put Mr. Fowler in 15 degrees of Trendelenburg? Don't let him out of the bed, but it's going to allow his heart to rest while preserving his stroke volume. That make sense? So you actually use these curves all the time in practical cardiology. Does that make sense? That was your question. So by way of finishing, let's see what I got left here. We still have, again, she put in too many slides, but we're about to change topic into muscle physiology, which I think you'll like. So notice everything we've talked about thus far is sort of about talking about what helps the heart to deliver blood to serve the rest of the body. But this last question actually brings up the issue that hearts need stuff. They have their own needs. And so if we don't serve the needs of the heart, bad things will happen. So I think this is showing us we have swirls of linear tissue wrapped around the central cavities. These wall, the myocardial wall, is made up of cardiac myocytes. They differ from, skeletal muscle myocytes can be this long. And because they're that long, they have to have many, many, many nuclei. Cardiac muscles do it a different way. Each cardiac muscle is quite small, with a single central nucleus, so it can diffuse one mononucleus, but they're connected. The green here is the connective tissue. So cardiac muscles don't have an external tendon. Their tendon is everywhere. They are interconnected to one another. Is that okay? But within, you can see the stripes here on this one cell. See those little stripy things inside? You know what those are. Alternating A and I bands of sarcomeres. She's better at graphics. Oh, there it goes. Go, little sarcomere, go. Does that look right? The actin framework is being pulled into the center. I don't know how to make videos. I'm just a simple man. So, just to remind you, a lot of this is very similar to what we had in 110C or EXP 101. The cycle that creates that lovely shortening is calcium is what exposes, it binds to the troponin C subunit that causes the tropomyosin. When calcium floods down, the actin binding site for myosin is hidden. When the calcium hits this, it binds to the C troponin, it changes its configuration, it exposes the binding site, and then immediately, boom, boom, the myosin binds and contracts. Remember, no ATP is used to create the initial twitch. Your muscle cells are preloaded. It's like walking around with a loaded gun, waiting for something to do. Ooh, that analogy. Where the ATP is used is to disconnect. Apparently this goes in a circle like this. So where the ATP is used is to disconnect. The ATP ACE is right there on the myosin heavy chain, and when ATP binds to that, it does two things. It disconnects it, and simultaneously, these two steps, as far as I'm concerned, are within a few fractions of a millisecond. It disconnects and resets the head to the power position. Is that all familiar? Okay. So contractility, I see why I'm talking. We're making a segue. Contractility has to do with just getting more force out of each cell. And that is really, you're going to see in a moment, going to be a function of how much free calcium is available to get these binding sites maximally exposed and create the greatest number of actinomycin cross bridges per millisecond. That's what contractility, that's where it comes from. Excellent. So, this is good because we're all caught up. I was worried we were falling behind, but we're going to be all caught up by the time we're done. So we're going to increasingly, so for the next lecture, we're going to begin to talk about these electrical, just like regular muscle. Calcium release is associated with action potentials coming from the surface of the cell and triggering the release of calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Does that sound familiar? Okay. There's a few issues. One is that instead of being long, continuous cells, myocytes are little cells that are all hooked up to each other. Right? And so one of the first conditions is they need to share spin. Remember, in a muscle, you can recruit one motor unit, and all the nearby muscle cells, insulated by the endomysiums, don't turn on. Right? If you're just walking, you're only using about 20% of your muscle mass is active in your legs, less. And the rest of them are quiescent. Hearts are not that way. Hearts go, if you turn on one cell, they're all going to go. because they are webbed up. The term syncytium means a functional whole. Even though you can isolate individual parts of it, when you use it, those all are done. So hearts are that way. They are a functional syncytium. And so a second thing is there's no nerve, and the nerve endings on the heart mostly go to the pacemakers, and they just modulate it up and down. So you don't have nerve endings here, or here, or here, or here. So you can't, it gets back, you can't activate a part of the heart. You have to activate the whole thing. And generally speaking, timing the heart is absolutely critical. If you first contract the ventricle, then contract the atria, and have the right heart out of timing with the left heart, you can just destroy the cardiac output. So it really has to, it's a dance between the partners, you know, top, bottom, out, top, bottom, and it's got to be choreographed. And we'll talk next time, is I think where we're headed is into these contractility issues. That I think you guys know, these pacemakers have a high rate of spontaneous depolarization, and they kind of act like a work crew boss to organize the ones below it. So in many ways, these are the workers who actually make the force, but this is the one that's saying, go down. You can almost picture building a pyramid. If you have a big crew pulling on one of those blocks, if everyone pulls in their own direction and at different times, the block doesn't go anywhere. And so there's a need for some 3, 2, pull. That's what the pacemakers are doing. We'll talk a lot about that next time. Okay, final point about how would you organize the speed and how would you organize the amount of force you get if the only thing we got to modulate sarcomeres is calcium. And that gets back to your basic physiology that you know better than me, that there are beta-adrenergic receptors in the cell membrane. So, especially in the pacemaker cells, if a nerve terminal from the sympathetic nerve system spills some epinephrine or norepinephrine on this, it, through a G-protein couple, the receptor interacts with these G-proteins. These G-proteins do something that activate the enzyme adenylate cyclase. You create this peculiar form of AMP that is circularized, and that thing serves as a activator, so you're getting a cascade to multiply the number of active molecules, protein kinase A. And protein kinase A runs all over the cell, handing people phosphates. Remember, kinase phosphorylates other molecules, and so protein kinase A goes all over the cell, phosphorylating those proteins that are most useful during high energy transfer. So as you remember from, I won't make you cry from ATP 101, but remember a whole bunch of enzymes that are related to ATP production are activated by protein kinase. Is that all vaguely familiar? Remember that in among the cells, among the proteins and enzymes that are activated by protein kinase A are the calcium handling proteins, the ones that are managing how much calcium is spilled, how fast is it put away, how many binding sites are we exposing. And so it turns out that simply spilling norepinephrine on a heart both increases its speed and at the individual cell level increases its force of contraction. And that's, I just gave you the setup for tomorrow's lecture. That's all we're going to talk about next time is how does that work. It's okay? Oh, I'm going to have an office hour today. So we're in the second week of the quarter. We've decided office hour is going to go from like 10 to 11:30. We still have to find an extra office hour, so I think it's Jose is going to be my leader in this, and I think it's going to be Wednesday, and you can kind of tell me if 10 is better or 11 is better, I don't care. But we'll set something up and see if it works for the other people. So I'll see you guys who are coming to office hour in 15 minutes. Okay?